The case was scheduled to resume on the 18th of May, but has now been pushed out until September. On the latest figures that I have seen, over 400,000 people have now signed a petition calling for Assange's freedom. A widely held view is that the USA failed to secure its IT system and that its wrongdoings, covert operations and war crimes were publicly and embarrassingly exposed. So, under the protection of national security being breached and lives being endangered, the US wants to make an example of Assange that exposing US secrets will not be tolerated. New revelations about the war crimes, where 11 civilians, including 2 journalists, were killed in Baghdad in July 2007, were recently exposed by The Guardian newspaper. Furthermore, there is no evidence that any lives were put at risk by the WikiLeaks revelations. It is also worth noting that Assange is not a US citizen and was not in the USA when the hacking occurred. The USA is attempting to extend its internal laws to overseas jurisdictions while simultaneously denying Assange protection under the US First Amendment that US citizens would otherwise be entitled to. Which brings me to Assange's treatment in England. Assange is in Belmarsh Prison for breaching bail in relation to a case that has been dropped. So, had there been no case, there would have been no bail and logically no breach. Just as extraordinary, Assange was harshly being kept in solitary confinement for breach of bail, what others might consider to be a penalty that is much harsher than would be normally expected. He wasn't a criminal that presented a threat to others in any way. It took a revolt by other prisoners for his prison conditions to be eased. His appearance in court earlier this year was in a cage, with restricted access even to his lawyers, which I would have thought would be totally against the legal system. Assange is not an English citizen, which all gives rise to concerns about his treatment, the process and his well-being. Nor has Assange been the only publisher of WikiLeaks material for which he is being pursued. As an Australian citizen, Julian Assange should be provided with Australian diplomatic support, the same as any other Australian who finds themselves in a similar situation overseas. He should be returned to Australia, and if the US government want to extradite him, they should apply to an Australian court under Australian law, where the principles of justice, as enshrined in Clause 29 of the 1215 Magna Carta, still hold true. The Julian Assange case is a test of Western democracy and the values that millions of lives have been lost defending. I refer to the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to know, upholding the Geneva Convention and the rules of military engagement, and the universal human rights of all people.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Vivian, playing cards. Collect the cards, connect the cards. I just popped out of my studio near the River Thames into Battersea Park. Julian Assange is America's most wanted man because he helped to expose American war crimes. He's a war hero. For that, they want to put him in concrete for 30 years. Julian knew this all along from various statements and emails, but now Trump has admitted it. Yet, Julian has never been charged with a crime. The Swedish allegations had no substance. That's why they had to drop them. I'm standing on the steps of the Buddhist temple in the park. I'm a Taoist, but I believe that everyone keeps the message of Jesus in their heart, that we should love each other. Julian Assange is the most famous victim of human rights abuse in the Western world, and he is a famous beacon of free speech. WikiLeaks never lies.
Yeah. Look, I'm all fucking what? What is this stuff? You what?
Hi John, so what was your impressions today?
Today, hello everybody. Today was an extraordinary circumstance of the prosecution saying that a man with no arms in solitary confinement ought to be getting along really well, and that Julian had nothing to worry about if he was put under SAMS, that's a security measurement in the jails of the United States. Also, the anonymous witnesses from Spain for the spying and surveillance on Julian will give evidence tomorrow or the day after. That'll be very interesting. But I just want everybody, including myself, to keep in mind what this is about. It is about the covering up, as I say each day, of war crimes that are so gross and great that the mind encompass. So there are just in the Iraq war cables, for example, there were found 15,000 extra deaths, but that is covered in a simple way of just saying 15,000. But 15,000 people, that's children and mothers and fathers and uncles, grandfathers, people like me. So that 15,000 is of people illegally murdered by the invasion of Iraq. So that's what this is about, is disguised with distraction some of the great war crimes of the 21st century. But please keep that in mind. This is to take our minds off. So any fight for Julian is a fight for ourselves, because the people that they murder, and principally war nowadays is against civilians. It's not against soldiers, it's against civilians. The people that they murder are us and our children, our mothers and grandfathers. So the firmer we are in determining that Julian shall not be extradited to the United States, the greater benefit to ourselves. Thank you.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We are now approaching the state of Orwell's dictum. Perfect dictum, that he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls internet servers controls the intellectual record of mankind, and by controlling that, controls our perceptions of who we are, and by controlling that, controls what laws and regulations we make in society.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We are now approaching the state of Orwell's dictum. Perfect dictum.
Can you say something?
Yeah, I can say I'm happy that it's not raining in London, and happy about that.
Okay, Josito?
Yeah, okay.
Wait.
Today we heard two very convincing witnesses basically elaborating a lot about the special administrative measures, which sounds quite bureaucratic, but which is really important because special administrative measures are taking place in the US in prisons, and we had two legal experts, two basically defense lawyers, explaining how special administrative measures are used for basically people, mainly terrorists or people who are under suspicion of being quite dangerous. And apart from the fact, honestly speaking, that it was disturbing that Julian Assange has been confirmed with really terrorists who really consciously killed people, I think it was interesting and important to hear that it's difficult under special administrative measures in US prison to gain actually the psychological and medical access which Julian Assange would need, and what we learned from last week's medical testimonies here, that he's really under a high medical risk, under the risk of actually committing suicide. And so this was, I would say, another convincing, to further convincing witnesses, which could and just lead to a decision by the court that actually Julian Assange has to be released out for humanitarian reasons. Apart from this, until the very end, there was a discussion in the court whether the two witnesses from Spain, actually two people working for UCI Global, should be giving their testimony anonymous or not. In the end, it looked like that actually both parties, the prosecution and the defense, agreed on that they are fine with giving their testimonies anonymous. I think it's important as well from a press freedom perspective, Reporters Without Borders perspective, the witness is a testimony from UCI Global, because there is a kind of sidearm of the whole trial, because there was a German broadcaster, NDR, who filed a complaint against UCI Global of having actually violated source protection of journalists having been in touch confidentially in the Ecuadorian embassy with Julian Assange. And I think that's why it's important to get as well the witnesses, whether it being anonymous or not. And apart from this, I mean, there was a discussion, or that it could be an option that the whole hearing already will finish on Thursday, or will just on Friday, with reading out as a kind of final thing the UCI Global testimonies. And yeah, I hope actually that the court, that the judge will take into consideration all the hard testimonies which actually are really making clear so much that actually Julian Assange is here on trial because of his journalistic work, because of his work as a publisher, having distributed information through WikiLeaks, which the public needed to know. And so once again, from a Reporters Without Borders perspective, we keep on demanding the immediate release, not only on humanitarian reasons, as well because of what he did was not wrong. WikiLeaks was just publishing information which the public deserved to know.
Thank you.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We are now approaching the state of Orwell's dictum. Perfect dictum, that he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls internet servers controls the intellectual record of mankind, and by controlling that, controls our perceptions of who we are, and by controlling that, controls what laws and regulations we make in society.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We are now approaching the state of Orwell.
Give me a sign. Okay, what happened today, Christian?
If there had been any doubt about what fate awaits Julian if he's extradited to the United States after today's testimony by two witnesses, there should be no doubt at all. It is terrifying to sit and listen about the situation that will await him in pre-trial detention, in isolation, and also when he is sentenced in a Supermax prison in Colorado. I say when because there is no doubt that he will be sentenced in Virginia if he's brought there on trial. We have that from past experience. We know that there is a 99.9% chance that he will be in that court. The facilities that he will have to endure the rest of his days are horrendous in description. It's a tiny cell. He will be placed under something called special administrative measures, SAMs for short. That means basically solitary confinement. That means basically torture by any standard. That means being in isolation 24/7, allowed only out an hour a day, minimal if any interaction with other inmates, very limited access to family. The lawyers even have a difficulty accessing the client. Family will not be able to visit, but on very rare occasions. And we heard that even correspondence with others who were in Supermax prison in Colorado had been intercepted. And we heard one instance where a terrorist sentenced inmate was basically reprimanded and endured more than he was enduring because he wrote to his son, "Tell my grandchild I love him." He was 1 year old. That was considered communicating a message to a possible enemy, the 1 year old. And it was suggested by the prosecution when this was brought up. The prosecution lawyer said, "Well, you do know," she said, told the witness, that many family members of that inmate have been involved in illegal activities. And one just raised your eyebrows. Was he suggesting that the 1 year old was a possible terrorist? It's simply absurd. It's simply absurd to hear how the lawyers for the United States are attempting to make it sound like this is not a horrible destiny to be transferred to those prison circumstances, both in pre-trial and then post-sentencing in the U.S. Anything speaks against it. Everything speaks against it. And if you just browse the internet, you will see what kind of measures you're under. You will not have health care. And for an individual like Julian, who comes from a very distressed background after all these years of confinement, given his mental conditions now, it is basically putting somebody to death to send him over to that destiny. And that has to be borne in mind in the court system here. There has to be a level of humanity on that question alone. And we were talking about, it was illustrative that we had to listen to the fate of terrorists that had been sentenced and put to prison in a Supermax prison in Colorado. You have to talk about the sentences that terrorists get. Yes, because that's the sentence that the publisher Julian Assange will get. Because he will be the first. And the prosecution's lawyer here on behalf of the United States, do you know if anybody who has published information under the and being indicted under the espionage had been put in Supermax prison? And the witnesses had to say no. This is the first. There is no other examples. That's why you have to revert to the fate of terrorists who've been sentenced to life imprisonment. So this is illustrative of what's at stake here. And it highlights basically the gravity of the situation here. Towards the end of the day, at least the judge, barrister, decided to give anonymity to two very important witnesses that have still to testify here from Spain, ex-employees of UC Global, the company that was spying on Julian and spying on Julian's interaction with his lawyers in the Ecuadorian embassy. And we will hear, of course, whom they were really working for, whose interest they were serving. And of course, we know that that was the three-letter institutions that have been seeking Julian and have decided to bring him down. And we know that these former employees will testify to the plans that were discussed in the Ecuadorian embassy to poison Julian Assange, to kidnap him, to do anything to get him out of there. This is what we're up against. This is what the attack these days on the freedom of the press looks like.
I just have another question, Kristen, concerning the tactics that the prosecution has had. And we heard from the second witness today that the UK courts had been misled on the Mr. Hamza case, almost telling them that there was no chance that he would end up in the ADX Florence. And it seems that the prosecution is using the same tactics in this court.
What was very important in the testimony on that example was just to unearth the willingness of the US to mislead other courts. So when they are saying and sitting in courts here and trying to make it sound that Julian Assange will get a short sentence, that he will not necessarily be put under special administrative measures, that he will get medical care, he can play bingo or cricket, things of that nature. They are playing a game. They've misled the courts before. That's now established. Why will they not do it again? And they are doing it here. That is fairly obvious to anybody who sits in the courtroom and listens to the arguments from the prosecution side.
Thank you.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We are now approaching the state of Orwell's dictum. Perfect dictum, that he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls internet servers controls the intellectual record of mankind, and by controlling that, controls our perceptions of who we are, and by controlling that, controls what laws and regulations we make in society.
This is Radio Free Assange.
They are about to take every right away from you. You will not be able to fight for any other cause. We are talking about the fundamentals here. We must fight against the extradition. We must save Julian Assange.
Every single, all the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world dedicating significant resources over the past 10 years to destroying its reputation. So it's at a stage now where it's actually you risk something to even defend him. So the facts are very hard to get out. But when you start looking into it, you see that actually this is not a fair trial at all. And from start to finish, it's been irregular. And